The envelope was heavier than it should have been, the kind of expensive stationery people choose when appearances matter more than affection. I held it in my hands on the porch that morning, sunlight falling across the faded welcome mat at my feet. My chest tightened even before I opened it. I knew. A mother always knows. Inside was a wedding invitation, embossed in gold lettering. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell requests the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter, Clara, to Mr. Daniel Hartman, my son's name, my only child. Yet nowhere did my name appear. Not as host, not as family, not even as a footnote. I stared so long that the letters blurred. My tea on the counter behind me went cold. My name is Eleanor Hartman. I am 67 years old, a widow for nearly 2 decades, and I raised Daniel alone after his father died. I worked 30 years at the town library, waking in the dark to unlock the doors, shelving books until my back ached, and reading bedtime stories when I got home. I stitched Halloween costumes by hand, clapped until my palms burned at every school concert, and whispered prayers into the silence so my boy would never feel the weight of being fatherless. And yet, here I stood, holding proof that I had been erased from the story of his life. The wedding wasn't at some distant church or rented hall. It was to be held at the lake house, the one my late husband and I bought together in Cedarbrook back in 1994. The deed still bore our names. By law, by memory, by every right that mattered. It was mine. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My son was marrying, and strangers had claimed my home for the celebration, printing their names in shining gold while mine was nowhere at all. I pressed the card flat on the table, watching the light glint off letters that cut sharper than any blade. Something inside me shifted then. Not tears. Not yet. Something steadier. A question that refused to stay quiet. Why am I letting this happen? And that was the moment my silence began to end. I sat at the kitchen table long after the envelope was shut away in the drawer. The silence of the house pressed against me, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. My mind, however, refused to stay in the present. It carried me backward, into years I could almost touch if I closed my eyes. Daniel had once been a boy who couldn't fall asleep unless he knew I was still in the hallway, humming softly. I remembered the way he gripped my hand when he lined up for his first soccer game, his knuckles white with nerves until I smiled. I remembered the Halloween when he insisted on being a pirate, and I stayed up past midnight sewing gold trim onto a vest so it would look real. He had laughed so hard when he saw it that I thought my heart would burst with pride. But somewhere between those years and now, the ground shifted. The phone calls grew shorter, often filled with hurried words, as if he were already on his way somewhere else. Visits became occasional, then rare. Holidays passed with excuses about being too busy this year. When Clara entered his life, the changes sharpened. She was polished, always polite, but she carried a distance in her eyes. I tried to bridge the gap, brought pies, small gifts, little reminders of home, but they rarely reached the warmth I intended. Once, I arrived at their apartment with his favorite apple tart. Clara smiled thinly and said they were on a juice cleanse. The tart stayed on the counter untouched, just like me. Now, holding that invitation with my name absent, I saw the truth I had been denying. Distance wasn't accidental anymore. It was chosen. And for the first time, I wondered if my silence had helped it grow. That evening, I reached for the phone, the one mounted on the wall with a cord that curled like an old vine. My fingers hesitated over the numbers, then moved on their own. It rang twice before a steady, familiar voice answered. Eleanor. It's been a while. Margaret. I breathed, and something inside me loosened. She was one of the few people who could still read the tremor in my silence. "You sound shaken," she said gently. "What happened?" I told her about the invitation, about how it wasn't addressed to me, how it named strangers as hosts while I stood outside my own son's story. There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, her voice had sharpened. "You need to look at the paperwork." "The paperwork?" I repeated, frowning. "The lake house. You and Robert bought it together, didn't you? His name's been gone nearly 20 years now. That means yours is the one that remains. If they're planning a wedding there without so much as a word, Eleanor, it's not forgetfulness. It's rewriting." Her words landed heavy, as if she had pressed a hand against my chest. That house had been Robert's dream, a place where the water touched the sky and the trees bent to listen. He had called it their escape hatch, and I had laughed then, thinking it was only sentiment. But when I pulled the old file box from the bottom drawer and opened the manila folder, I saw his handwriting, his signature, and then mine. The deed, still valid. Joint ownership with survivorship. And now, mine alone. The bills, the tax statements, all still linked to my account. I wasn't a guest. I wasn't background. I was the foundation they had tried to erase. The next morning, I packed a small overnight bag. I slipped the folder with the deed into the front pocket and set it on the passenger seat. The drive to Cedarbrook took 40 minutes, though it felt both endless and far too short. Each mile pulled me closer to a reckoning I had avoided for years. When the gravel path came into view, my breath caught. The lake house stood tall, but it was no longer the place Robert and I had chosen. The pale blue siding he had insisted on was gone, replaced by sharp white boards and black shutters. The lilac bush I had planted on our 30th anniversary, gone, uprooted. Even the porch railing he had sanded smooth one summer had been stripped away, replaced with something sleek, cold, and lifeless. For a moment, grief washed over me heavier than anger. I had lost Robert once, and here I was, losing him again, piece by piece, memory by memory, painted over until nothing familiar remained. On the porch, Clara stood with a clipboard, issuing instructions to a group of men hauling chairs across the lawn. Daniel lingered nearby, his eyes on a stack of papers, nodding occasionally. Neither of them noticed me at first. My footsteps crunched the gravel, and when I climbed the porch steps, Daniel looked up. His expression shifted, surprise, confusion, and then something that resembled guilt. "Mom," he said slowly, setting the papers aside. Clara straightened, her smile thin, professional. "Eleanor, we're a little pressed for time. Could this wait?" I reached into my bag and pulled out the deed, unfolding it with deliberate care. "No, it can't." I placed it in her hands. "This property," I said evenly, "belongs to me." That evening, the rehearsal dinner unfolded like something torn from a glossy magazine. Strings of soft light draped across the patio. A jazz trio played in the corner, and napkins were folded into perfect origami swans. Guests in tailored suits and elegant dresses filled the tables, their laughter carrying easily over the music. I walked through the crowd unnoticed at first, just another figure in the swirl of satin and polished shoes. But when I reached the head table, I did not pause. I pulled out the empty chair between Daniel and Clara's father and sat down. My blouse was plain compared to the sequins around me, but I sat tall, steady, unflinching. Daniel glanced sideways at me, his lips parting as though to say something, but he closed them again. Clara's smile froze in place. She did not ask me to move. She couldn't, not with so many eyes upon us. Her fingers tightened around her champagne flute, and though her voice stayed light as she greeted the guests, her eyes flicked toward Daniel more than once. The meal passed in careful conversation. Someone across the table asked where I had found my blouse. I told them, truthfully enough, that it came from a little boutique years ago. They complimented the cut, and for a fleeting moment, I felt the kind of warmth I hadn't known in years, not because I was invited, but because I had claimed my place. When dessert arrived, Clara rose for a toast. She thanked her parents for their unwavering support, Daniel for his partnership, and the many friends who had made this night possible. Her glass glittered in the candlelight as she raised it high. She did not thank me, but I didn't need her words anymore. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the music had faded, the house felt like a stage after the curtain fell. The air was too still, heavy with what hadn't been said. I slipped quietly into the kitchen, opened the drawer labeled Household Shared, and placed a folded letter inside. It was brief, precise. This property remains under the legal ownership of Eleanor Hartman. Any use for personal or commercial events requires my written consent. Unauthorized use will result in legal recourse. I didn't write it to provoke. I wrote it to anchor the truth where no one could ignore it. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee as the first pale light touched the lake. I heard footsteps before I saw her. Clara entered in silk pajamas, her hair pinned loosely, her face scrubbed bare. For a moment, surprise flickered when she realized I was already there. "Did you sleep all right?" she asked, her voice polite but flat. "Yes," I answered. "The guest room is still comfortable." She poured herself tea with movements too sharp, too careful. Silence stretched between us until she finally spoke again. "You think we've treated you badly?" I tilted my head, watching her. "Have you?" Her hand trembled just enough to make the spoon clink against the cup. "I never meant to replace you," she said quietly. "I just needed space. And Daniel, he followed my lead." "Maybe he shouldn't have," I replied. Her eyes lifted to mine, unguarded for just a breath. There was a crack in her composure, the smallest trace of doubt. "I just want the day to go smoothly," she whispered. "For everyone?" I asked. She hesitated. "Yes, for everyone." The ceremony began beneath a canopy of white roses and silk ribbons, the lake shimmering behind as though it too had been invited. Guests whispered in admiration, the string quartet playing notes so delicate they seemed to hang in the air like lace. Every detail was flawless, orchestrated with precision. When the usher offered to seat me near the back, I smiled politely and kept walking. My heels clicked against the stone path as I moved past row after row until I reached the front. A single chair had been left empty, almost as if someone had remembered me at the last possible moment but couldn't decide where I belonged. I claimed it without hesitation, smoothing my skirt and folding my hands in my lap. Clara's parents sat just a few feet away, stiff with their perfect posture. Her mother gave me a polite nod. Her father didn't look at me at all. But I didn't shrink. My gaze remained forward, fixed on the altar. Daniel stood waiting, his hands clasped in front of him, face pale with nerves. When Clara appeared, radiant in her gown, the crowd stirred with awe. Yet my eyes didn't follow her. I kept them on him. And then it happened. Just once, fleeting but undeniable. He looked at me. Our eyes locked, and in that single moment, I refused to smile, refused to nod as if asking for permission to exist. I simply held his gaze, steady, unblinking, as if to say, "I am here. You cannot erase me." The vows unfolded, promises exchanged, rings slipped onto fingers. Applause rose like a wave when it was done. I did not join in. I sat still, hands folded, feeling the truth anchor itself inside me. The morning after the wedding, the house was hushed in a different way. No clinking glasses, no laughter floating from the patio, just the quiet that follows something too large to linger. I rose early, brewed coffee, and sat at the kitchen table as the mist lifted from the lake. It was nearly 8 when Daniel came downstairs. Gone were the tuxedo and polished shoes. He wore an old flannel shirt, the kind his father used to live in during summer repairs at the lake house. For a moment, I saw the boy again, the child who whispered goodnight through a cracked door. He poured himself coffee and sat across from me. Not too close, not too far, just there. "I read your letter," he said finally, his voice rough. I waited. "You wrote that you didn't need applause," he continued. "Just not to be erased." I nodded slowly. His eyes dropped to his hands. I think I let it happen without realizing. Clara would say something, or leave something out, and I wouldn't correct her. You'd send gifts, call, and I kept telling myself I'd answer later. I thought it wasn't serious, but it was. Silence stretched between us. The hum of the refrigerator filled the space where excuses could have lived. "I didn't forget you, Mom," he whispered, "but I made it look like I did." "That," I said gently, "is exactly what forgetting looks like." He flinched, shame flickering across his face. "I'm not proud of it." "Good," I replied softly. "If you were, we'd have a bigger problem." When he finally met my eyes again, there was no defense left in him, just honesty, raw and bruised. "I'm sorry," he said. This time, I believed him. 3 weeks passed, and the house finally exhaled. The chairs were gone, the ribbons packed away, and the patio no longer glittered with the last traces of confetti. What remained was quieter, softer, a place returning to itself. The yard was uneven again, the grass growing wild at the edges the way Robert liked it. I settled into my days the way one slips back into a well-worn coat. I watered the porch plants, sorted the mail, and walked down to the shoreline with a book tucked under my arm. Often, the book stayed closed while I listened to the lap of the water against the rocks. It was enough just to be there. One afternoon, a small gray cat wandered across the porch steps, its ribs showing beneath a dusty coat. I set out a saucer of milk, and by the next morning, she returned. I named her Hazel, after the trees lining the far side of the lake. She stayed, curling into the crook of the porch swing like she had been waiting all along, and then, with the ground damp from rain, I planted a new lilac bush near the porch, not in the old spot. Too much had been torn out there, but close enough for memory. The soil clung stubbornly to my gloves, but I worked it loose, pressing the roots into place. When I stood back, mud streaking my knees, I felt something stir inside me. Not joy, not quite, but steadiness, continuity. I no longer needed to reclaim what had been stolen piece by piece. I could plant new things, right here, on my own terms. A week later, I opened the old folder one final time. The deed lay there, edges worn. Robert's signature faded beside mine. I slipped it into a simple wooden frame and hung it in the hallway, just above the light switch. It wasn't out of spite. It wasn't a trophy. It was memory. And it was fact. A reminder to myself that no matter how many times others tried to write me out, I had been here all along. I caught myself looking at it often, when I passed by with laundry, when I set Hazel's bowl on the floor, when I reached to turn off the light at night. Each glance steadied me. People like to forget mothers. We make it easy. We fold ourselves small so others can stretch. We give without asking. We step aside so they can shine, and in the quiet, we disappear. But disappearance doesn't mean absence. It only means we've been written in invisible ink. The truth is, I had been complicit in my own erasure. Every time I stayed silent, every time I told myself patience would fix the distance, I helped build the wall that stood between us. That was the hardest part to admit, not what they had done, but what I had allowed. Standing there in the hallway, the frame deed catching the afternoon light. I felt something unfamiliar after so many years. Resolve. I hadn't spoken up to be liked. I hadn't reclaimed my seat at the table to win applause. I had done it because enough was enough, and maybe, just maybe, because when mothers finally say no more, the world has no choice but to listen. Spring settled gently over Cedarbrook, and the lilac bush I had planted began to bud. Each morning I checked the small green shoots, watching them push stubbornly toward the light. Hazel sprawled across the porch swing, purring like she had claimed the place as fiercely as I had. The house was quiet again, but not in the hollow way it had been before. This silence carried weight, not absence. It was the sound of something that had finally stopped unraveling. I thought often about the wedding, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Daniel hadn't called since that morning at the table, and Clara certainly hadn't reached out. Oddly, I found I didn't need them to. Silence, when it follows truth, isn't rejection. It's consequence. The neighbors sometimes asked if I had enjoyed hosting the wedding. I smiled and answered simply, I was there. That was enough. One evening, I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, the lake catching the last light of day. I realized that for the first time in years. I wasn't waiting for a phone call, for an invitation, for someone else to acknowledge me. I was simply present, steady as the water reflecting the sky. People may forget mothers. They may rewrite us out of the story, pretend we are background when we are in fact the ground itself. But I had reminded them, not with fury, not with shame, only with truth. And truth, once spoken, cannot be erased. I didn't stand up to be liked. I stood up because I had bent far enough. The lilacs would bloom soon, and when they did, they would carry Robert's memory and my own resilience together, rooted deep, impossible to uproot again. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these family drama and revenge stories, please subscribe and join me for more every day.